Hey everybody. This is a translation of a piece by Grandizo and Munis from 1946. It's titled The Revolutionaries in the Face of Russia and World Stalinism. So here we go. First section, Necessity of this work. Contrary to our provisions, the parties and groups of the Fourth International, with rare exceptions, have shown themselves excessively hostile to changing their policy towards the USSR. For certain reasons, in Europe and the United States for others, there, because of the terrible illusions engendered by the triumphs of an army that the masses believed to be revolutionary, there, out of opportunism, they have not been able to change the pattern of, quote, unconditional defense into a struggle against the Kremlin and revolutionary defeatism, as with the change in the military situation and the externalization of Stalinist policy. The magnitude of the main danger for the Soviet and Eastern European proletariat has shifted from Berlin to Moscow. In some cases, quote, unconditional defense has even taken a right-wing form, alien to the position of the Fourth International. Our hope that the Fourth International would be able to quickly change its policy was based on the assurance that the, quote, Red Army would brutally expose the oppressive and reactionary character of the Kremlin's foreign policy, a reflection of its domestic policy. This was indeed the case, and our predictions were even exceeded. However, as a general rule, either the current importance and future scope of Stalinist vandalism in Eastern Europe and Asia have been minimized, fearing to face it head-on, or neglected, taking refuge, as if in a tranquil world, in the character of the Soviet economy and the definition of a, quote, degenerated workers' state, from which in the past we had deduced, quote, unconditional defense. The urgency of a change in our policy toward the USSR is, to varying degrees, evident in the inner thoughts of the majority. The problem stares us in the face and threatens to break our ribs, but almost everyone stops superstitiously before it, like the Israelites in the desert who stopped before the Ark of the Covenant, for fear of being struck down at its approach. In reality, all that threatens to crush us, or at least leaves us for a long time in impotent organic rickets, is our already false position towards the USSR and world Stalinism, a mere reaffirmation of outdated positions without a shadow of justification in all the events of the last 6 years. Enormous disturbances have occurred all over the world, including the USSR, and we continue to paraphrase what was said when no great event had yet occurred. There is here a mental laziness and an ideological pusillanimity alien to the revolutionary spirit, and, of course, dangerous independently of the problem of the USSR. We have not only the urgent duty to reconsider the problem of the USSR in the light of the last 6 years, but also the duty to cast a glance back and point out what we may discover right and wrong in the analysis that supported the, quote, unconditional defense. This will be very instructive, given the importance of the Russian phenomenon in clarifying the materialist interpretation of history. I can only address this last point incidentally, touching on it, and without going into depth. The most urgent thing, what obsesses this work, is the need to change our position towards the USSR and world Stalinism. What paralyzes the Fourth International and holds it back in positions that have been overtaken by events is the idea of the property system reigning in the USSR. More than static, this idea has been transformed into a myth with which it is believed to answer all objections and stifle all protests. The bureaucracy is a tyrannical caste comparable only to Hitler's gang. Its police system spreads terror, especially against revolutionaries. In the USSR and everywhere it penetrates, its millions of leeches suck an enormous part of the national rent. No freedom is conceivable under its domination. There exists between it and the proletariat, economically and spiritually, as much difference or more than between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie of any dog of a capitalist country. The world revolution is for it the supreme evil. It treats the international proletariat as a vile commodity, as a bargaining chip in its repugnant dealings with the great imperialist countries. All this and the endless etc. that could be added to it is commonplace in our ranks. No one will deny it. But after listening to it with an air of indulgence, the voice of routine breaks from its throne. Yes, but in the USSR there is nationalized and planned property, which in itself is a great progressive factor in capital H history. Bureaucracy is only an excrescent. The system is good, but the methods are bad. The first must be defended and the second fought. The main enemy is imperialism. The bureaucracy will fall later. Quote, we must not throw the baby out with the bathwater, end quote. ... And everyone knows the rest by heart. Before the war, these arguments had a basis, though not immutable, and a serious political meaning, though unproven. Today they are nothing more than empty words, because they lack any real basis, and their political meaning is absurd. One second. I want to copy this down. Attacking the problem of bias. What proof do we have today that means of production planning exists in the USSR? None, other than the absence of a Kremlin decree formally abolishing it. There are certainly comrades in our international who would need this decree or the reestablishment of capitalism by violence to stop reciting stale formulas. If we cannot present such a decree, no one, in exchange, can present facts and figures guaranteeing planning, because if we have never known exactly what was happening economically in the USSR since the beginning of the third five-year plan, we know much less. The little that has filtered through official data and the deductions they allowed does not speak in favor of planning. All the voice of routine can offer is the word plan on Stalin's lips. Napoleon III, too, used to say, quote, my name is inseparable from the revolution, end quote. Well, in Stalin's mouth, the invocation of planning as a remnant of the October Revolution has much less reality. Listen carefully, much less reality than the invocation of the French Revolution in Napoleon III's mouth. We shall see why. One second here. One second, sorry. Sorry, I have to copy this section down. Sorry about that. Important paragraph there. New section, planning and bureaucratic counter-revolution. Where should we start from to analyze the Russian phenomenon? From the objective character of planning or from the objective-subjective character of the Stalinist counter-revolution? If the objective character of planning existed, and even if we admit that planning still exists in X proportion, the second, who would dare to deny it, has existed for enough years and has consolidated its domination. It is not a purely political domination that can easily be categorized under the domination of outgrowth, but a domination with a solid material basis in the Soviet economic system. And right there, that's a critique of Trotsky who have the idea of like a political revolution based on the fact that the bureaucracy was an outgrowth as opposed to a political outgrowth as opposed to an essential feature of the Stalinist economic system, which is what Munis is saying here. However much the voice of routine regrets this, it is a fact that of such overwhelming objectivity that it will not be able to smother it under the one-sided objectivity of planning, even if, in order to force it to respond, we hypothetically concede that this remains intact. In the past, we have granted planning preeminence over the Stalinist counter-revolution. This was justified by the hope of a revolutionary revival of the Soviet proletariat, and by the assurance that the triumph of the revolution in any country would change the world balance of forces and bring about the fall of the bureaucracy. In any case, we have underestimated the importance of the counter-revolutionary factor. Experience has shown that planning has not succeeded in changing the bureaucracy, while the bureaucracy has obviously changed planning to the point of making itself objective in well-rooted economic positions. If yesterday, with only political power and relatively limited economic privileges, the bureaucracy succeeded in conducting planning for planning's own benefit, for the bureaucracy's own benefit, it can be affirmed that today it regards its economic management as a function of its particular interest, which means that it acts essentially like any bourgeoisie, that is, motivated by profit. That is, the bureaucracy is motivated by profit. It is therefore a monstrous absurdity to continue to speak of the objectively revolutionary character of planning, which is imposed on the bureaucracy and manifests itself in spite of it in the domestic and foreign policy of Russia. Any manifestation of this kind today demands nothing less than the revolutionary destruction of the bureaucracy and its main institutions. Zigzagging between left and right, the various regimes of history based on private property have had, at their best, political manifestations that reflected their progressive character. Without going beyond the foundations of the economic system on which they rested, capitalism was able to grant, under pressure from the masses, if not voluntarily, universal suffrage and what were called individual guarantees. But if we admitted the existence of authentic planning in the USSR, we'd have on the basis the most progressive system in history, surpassable only by the classless and stateless communist society, the most reactionary of political systems comparable in the modern era to fascism, and in antiquity to the most rotten phase of the Roman Empire. Even without any economic analysis, one is forced to recognize that the Russian economic system must no longer retain anything progressive, or the relationship between economics and politics, the cornerstone of our notions and of the materialist interpretation of history, will collapse. Economic development and political development should then take opposite directions, and human history would be Schopenhauer's inexplicable chaos. Right? And that's kind of like another critique of Trotsky, is the idea that, you can have this completely reactionary political machine and then a progressive economy at the same time. Halfway between capitalism and socialism. The argument of excrescence that will certainly be opposed to us here is flawed at first glance. The assertion of the preceding paragraph is not refuted by the recognition that bureaucracy does not represent a new economic system but a moment of indecision between two poles, and that consequently everything we see in the USSR is transitory. In the first place, the transitory character of a regime in no way gives it the authorization to put historical laws in its pocket and develop progressively in economic terms and reactionarily in political terms, because between a given economic system and its political organization, there is a constant interpenetration. In the second place, there is no reason to hope for a relaxation in 5 or 20 more years of the savage bureaucratic dictatorship. In this sense, one can only hope for a new revolution that would restore power and the economy to the proletariat. In this sense, one can only hope for a new revolution that would restore power and the economy to the proletariat. So still operating in this Trotskyist frame, right, that the working class did at one point have management of the economy and the state. In this sense, one can only hope for a new revolution that would restore power in the economy to the proletariat. If the bureaucracy's economic management had continued to be objectively progressive, this would have manifested itself in domestic and foreign policy, especially since the crushing of German imperialism. But on the contrary, we have seen Stalinist absolutism strengthen in the USSR and practice abroad a policy of economic plunder and persecution of the revolutionary movement that leaves that of imperialism far behind. The fact that bureaucracy is considered something provisional, far from justifying the separation of economic development from the political system, casts doubt on the real existence of this separation. Who does not feel the need to stop and reflect seriously on this? Moreover, by calling bureaucracy an excrescence, by pointing out its provisional character, we believe we are making a very serious and scientific analysis, but this is not the case. It is here, on the contrary, that the vulnerability or inadequacy of our previous analysis appears, which continues to be current for a large part of our international, and where the continuity of defensism is seriously distorted. In any transitional social form, the most important thing is not its transitory character, but the direction of its progress, unless we fall, whether we recognize it or not, into the hilarious notion of a fixed transitory, where the bureaucratic excrescence would never exceed the proportions of a wart on the human body. The Fourth International has often pointed out the counter-revolutionary character of the bureaucracy and its regression towards capitalism. However, the unconditional defense rested certainly on the confidence that planning, having reached a certain degree of development, would rid itself of the bureaucratic excrescence and regain its socialist and revolutionary face. This internal perspective was combined externally with the hope that the revolution in Europe would give a hand to the Soviet proletariat before the bureaucracy could crush the last remnant of the October Revolution. Although the triumph of the revolution was delayed more than the Fourth International anticipated, it seems to us today that the confidence placed in it is The internal perspective was combined externally with the hope that the revolution in Europe would give a hand to the Soviet proletariat before the bureaucracy could crush the last remnant of the October Revolution. Although the triumph of the revolution was delayed more than the Fourth International anticipated, it seems to us today that the confidence placed in it justified the defense of the USSR more than the mere objective factor of planning, even leaving its degree of effective existence in suspense for the moment. Why? Precisely because, while awaiting an uninterrupted development of planning, we did not attribute to the bureaucracy the characteristics of something provisional, of an excrescence, but of a class consubstantial with planning. Indeed, the intrinsic character of a class lies in that class's unity with the economic system on which that class is based, the one which it sees itself by interest obliged to develop, thus creating the conditions for their common destruction. On the contrary, the intrinsic character of a social excrescence or a provisional regime is its opposition of interest with the economic system on which it is based, which it cannot develop without adjusting it to itself, without removing the contradiction. In partially expounding this idea, the international organization has always said that the bureaucracy introduces quantitative changes which, in the absence of a new revolution, will be transformed into qualitative ones. Well then, is there anyone in the international who needs more exploitation of surplus value by the Russian ruling caste, more legal or surreptitious theft, more millions of men condemned to pure and simple slavery, more mass murders and deportations, more police terror, more misery of the masses, more economic and social distance between, quote, those above, end quote, and those below, end quote, more methodical suppression of freedoms, more prostitution of social consciousness, more asphyxiation of all cultural manifestations, more economic plundering of the occupied territories, more flooding with religious opium and civil opium, more totalitarian despotism in general, in order to recognize the transformation of quantity into quality. What does the voice of routine, which frequently reassures itself by frightening others with the word dialectic, answer? To further our idea, let us resort to the concept of Bonapartism, more or less familiar to the entire international. We must now draw attention primarily to the differences between Napoleonic Bonapartism and Stalinist Bonapartism. Until now, we have focused too one-sidedly on the similarities. As a social subversion, as man's action on his history, the French Revolution was not the work of the bourgeoisie, but of the urban poor masses and feudal serfs. The complete and rapid destruction of the economic system and political apparatus of feudalism would have been impossible without the conquest by the artisans and workers of the right of insurrection, something which the modern proletariat will have to take into account against future thermidors. Thanks to this right, the poor districts of Paris wrested one measure after another from the moderate majority of the Convention, frequently from the Jacobins themselves, and made an incursion into political power by establishing the rule of the Commune and proclaiming the revolutionary government. Only in this way could the bourgeois revolution reach its own completion. But the political domination of the poor masses was to be ephemeral, for they had not yet played the role in the capitalist system necessary to imprint a socialist direction on society. The means of production were not yet sufficiently developed. However, economic measures directed against the bourgeoisie itself were not lacking. Mathiez points out that the Thermidor coup d'etat occurred when the Committee of Public Safety attempted to implement a law of expropriation for the benefit of the poor, which affected a large number of bourgeois and speculators. Mathiez is like a historian. I'm pretty sure Mathiez was like a French historian who was a Communist Party member. Is kind of like, to my understanding, pretty much revered Maximilien Robespierre. Yeah, that's just, if you're just wondering who Mathiez is. Mathiez points out that the Thermidor coup d'etat occurred when the Committee of Public Safety attempted to implement a law of expropriation for the benefit of the poor, which affected a large number of bourgeois and speculators. The commune and the poor masses in general were rendered powerless, but they had already and forever annihilated feudalism. The process of political readjustment that took place between Thermidor and the Bonapartist era itself can only be considered as the stabilization of the bourgeois revolution. Bonapartism did not deny the revolution or destroy the revolution's work. It gave it the legal legitimacy and political tranquility essential to the development of the capitalist economy. Beneath his military laurels and his splendor of an upstart emperor, Napoleon hid the sordidness of a system whose progression required that the political incursion of the urban masses be repelled, and that they be confined within the limited order by the slavery of wage labor and the dictatorship of the capitalists. In short, since the capacity of the means of production hid the perspective of a socialist revolution, the workers and artisans, the sans-culottes in general, had to be removed from the affairs of the bourgeoisie after they had destroyed the feudal system. Thermidor undertook this work, and Bonapartism completed it. Without giving this statement too literal a meaning, we can assure that the bourgeois revolution needed a Thermidor and a Bonapartism because its fundamental aim consisted in developing a class that owned the means of production and political power, and another class of wage earners deprived of both. From the profoundly different nature of the proletarian revolution can be deduced the destructive effects that Stalinist Bonapartism must produce within it. It is impossible to consider Stalinist Bonapartism as the stabilization of the socialist revolution, nor as it is impossible to consider Stalinist Bonapartism as the stabilization of the social revolution, nor Stalinist Bonapartism's I fucked that up. From the profoundly different nature of the proletarian revolution can be deduced the destructive effects that Stalinist Bonapartism must produce within it. It is impossible to consider Stalinist Bonapartism as the stabilization of the social revolution, nor as its legal legitimation, nor as necessary for the historical destiny of the worker of October. The system of production and distribution that resulted from the French Revolution was consubstantial with the bourgeoisie, and the need to bring the lower classes to reason produced Bonapartism. On the contrary, the system of production and distribution that resulted from the proletarian revolution is consubstantial with the proletariat. The triumph of Bonapartism, therefore, takes on a completely different character, since it attacks the class identified with the socialist system of production, strips the class identified with the socialist system of production of political power and economic management, and passes political power and economic management to social layers, political, technical, and administrative bureaucracy that have nothing consubstantial with the socialist destiny of the revolution. The only common feature between Napoleonic Bonapartism and Stalinist Bonapartism is the defense of their respective positions against the propertied classes prior to the revolution and against the masses. But while Napoleonic Bonapartism, by striking the extreme right and the extreme left, defended the new system of property, Stalinist Bonapartism, particularly fierce against the extreme left, far from defending socialist property, constitutes itself its principal assailant. Its opposition to the old propertied classes does not stem from its identification with socialist property, but from the empire it exercises over socialist property and against socialist property, which opens up its own economic perspectives. The Bonapartism of the French Revolution was a political expression of capitalist property. In asserting itself, it affirmed a new economic system. Stalinist Bonapartism, on the other hand, being a political expression of the interests of non-proletarian social strata, except for the old bourgeoisie, destroys, as it asserts itself, the economic system born of the revolution. This is why we have previously said in a purely affirmative form that in Stalin's mouth, the invocation of planning as a continuation of the October Revolution had much less meaning than the evocation of the French Revolution in the mouth of Napoleon III. This was undoubtedly an emanation of the necessities of the property system resulting from the French Revolution, when capitalism had not yet completed its phase of progress. But who would dare to maintain that Stalin and Stalin's caste of parasites are also firmly rooted in socialist property? And if this is not the case, what is the point of identifying the interests of the bureaucracy with those of planning? Unless we deny this identification, it leads to the essential idea supported by the theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism. Indeed, according to its defenders, the technical and political bureaucracy is interested in developing the nationalization and planning of the economy. It merges with them and extracts from them the characteristics of a class. While condemning it, a good part of the International today finds itself prisoner of the essential idea of bureaucratic collectivism. The error arises from a purely static conception of bureaucracy and from too crude an idea of planning. We have frequently compared the bureaucracy of the, quote, degenerated worker state with that of a yellow trade union. That's not really quite correct. A yellow trade union, maybe the term is, to my understanding, a yellow trade union is a trade union that's like a company trade union. What's usually referred to in the Trotskyist milieu is a non-company trade union. It's kind of like bureaucratized and has like reactionaries in the leadership, or maybe is corrupted. With like crime or something like that. I've never heard. This is the first time I've ever heard anything speaking of like a yellow trade union. The error arises from a purely static conception of bureaucracy and from too crude an idea of planning. We have frequently compared the bureaucracy of the, quote, degenerated worker state with that of a yellow trade union. Up to a certain point and for a certain period of time, the comparison was just and expressive. But an essential difference exists between the two bureaucracies. the importance of which growing from year to year, must today constitute one of the cornerstones of our analysis of the Russian phenomenon and of our attitude towards it. The trade union bureaucracy, as well as that of the reformist parties, is kept within its own limits. 1. By the existence of capitalism, the owner of the means of production of political power. Its social function is precisely determined by the clash between the antagonistic poles of society. It dampens the class struggle by making it compatible as far as possible with present-day society. The yellow trade union is useful to the bourgeoisie as a barrier to revolutionary activities, and at the same time, it cannot completely detach itself from the interests of the proletariat. The trade union cannot completely detach itself from the interests of the proletariat without destroying the source of its privileges and losing among the masses the influence that makes it useful to the bourgeoisie, hence its considerable stability as a workers' bureaucracy. The situation of the Stalinist bureaucracy in the USSR is quite different. It was also initially situated between the proletariat and the restorationist tendencies of the bourgeoisie, the urban petty bourgeoisie, and the kulaks. This is the period when it could be considered without any reservations as a workers' bureaucracy. In order not to lose its position, it had to develop the planned state economy. But as it did so, by completely eliminating the possibility of capitalist restoration through the old classes, the bureaucracy increasingly differentiated itself from the proletariat, economically and politically, by creating its own center of conservative interests. On the eve of the war, its hold on power, production, and distribution was absolutely totalitarian. It had ceased to occupy an intermediate position. Indeed, it seems undeniable that in Soviet or Russian society, we prefer to call it Russian, the extreme poles have been for years, the bureaucracy on the extreme right and the proletariat on the extreme left, but this is an essential fact which decisively modifies the social function of the bureaucracy, and from which the international must draw all the consequences which derive from it, under penalty of abandoning itself to a theoretical drone with grave consequences. This characterization, the side note for myself, this characterization of the bureaucracy as an extreme right and the proletariat as an extreme left is a distinction from Trotsky's conception. Trotsky considered the Stalinist bureaucracy to be represented as like a kind of like a totalitarian center, right? Which Trotsky was talking before Barbarossa and the Holocaust, but is only different from he called it only different from fascism, and it's more unbridled savagery or barbarity or something like that. But he viewed the bureaucracy as a center, right? And viewed its counter-revolutionary. It had not initiated a counter-revolution. The right, in his view, were people who like pro-NEP forces, people who favored the continuation of the market economy and some of the social tendencies within. The interest that benefited most from the NEP, which would have been like the netmen or the so-called kulaks. So he did like Trotsky insisted on using that scheme of like Stalinist center, Bukharinist right, left opposition. Anyway, by what mechanism or historical law should the extreme right of Russian society set itself up as the guardian, always against its will, of the planned economy? If it did so, the bureaucracy would not work against its will in complete freedom to defend its interest. What once compelled it to develop planning was the fear of being displaced from its position of power and privileges by a restoration of the old classes. The danger is absolutely non-existent today. While it is true that in both the countryside and the city, some old remnants of private property still exist, or that new ones have been created in both cases, the majority is closely tied to the bureaucracy, and the independent fraction of this property is but a feather in the cap compared to the crushing heap of conservative economic interest of the ruling caste. Economically and politically, the bureaucracy is the reactionary extreme right. There is nothing that can force it to rely on the proletariat and develop planning. It, despite everything, the voice of routine maintains that the bureaucracy looks after the interests of the planning. Then we must strip ourselves of all terminological camouflage and frankly recognize that the theory of bureaucratic collectivism is correct. Bureaucracy and planning are consubstantial for an entire historical period. They combine in a system where the former has the power to associate socialist production with the capitalist system of distribution, exploitation, and hierarchy. Now, this is a side note, another side note for myself. It seems like what he's speaking of here is specifically. I mean, maybe I'm incorrect in this, and especially I think Munis and Shachtman signed like a joint declaration in 19. I believe they signed it. They collaborated in some capacity. In the 1948 Second Congress of the Fourth International. In that, it seems like spacing out. What I'm trying to say is that the type of bureaucratic collectivist theory which Munis is talking about here sounds like Reitzian bureaucratic collectivism theory, which did view Stalinism or as a moment of a larger bureaucratic collectivist wave that would encompass the whole world. The bureaucratization of the world. And he viewed Stalinism and Hitlerism and fascism as part of this bureaucratic collectivist wave, which would constitute a transitional society between capitalism and socialism. So Stalinism, Hitlerism, and fascism, despite their brutality, were progressive forces in human history, and that which is distinct from bureaucratic collectivist theory as laid out in the Workers' Party, which viewed it as something specific to Russia and specific to Stalinism. And obviously they thought that Stalinism could spread, obviously, and Stalinist parties existed outside of the USSR. But they did not view Stalinism as some kind of bridge between capitalism and socialism. They did not have that opinion. They viewed it as a reactionary accident of history. They did not view it as having a progressive content, at least in the sense that Rizzi thought it had a progressive content. There was some ambiguity in Shachtman when he first adopted the bureaucratic collectivist thesis, which came after the split of the Workers' Party from the Socialist Workers' Party. Did view it as a progressive form in the sense that it had nationalized property, but then quickly kind of abandoned that and started labeling it instead as barbarism. So kind of totally switched courses on that position. This is a radically different perspective from that of Rizzi. And I think people say that, I think Sean Matt Gomna, for instance, maybe he got it from Munis, Grandizo Munis, I don't know, or Munis. But the idea that, in fact, it was the Fourth International, the post-Trotskyist Trotskyism, that adopted a form of Reitziism um, when it viewed Stalinism as, a potentially, or as like a transitional society. When they started to use the word transitional society to describe Stalinism, as like in some sense, like halfway between capitalism and socialism. They might not use they didn't use the word to generate a worker state as often, although that's kind of the theoretical underpinnings of it essentially remain the same. They started to view, especially Pablo, viewed the Stalinist society as like a type of society that could dominate an entire epoch. So their notion of Stalinism being a transitional society was comparable to Ritzi's view of Stalinism as a transitional society that was not halfway between capitalism. That was like transitional. That was transitional between capitalism and socialism. They both held that view. So it seems like that is what, I mean, at least from my reading, I might, when listening to this later, I might think it was wrong. I think what I'm saying is wrong, but it seems like he's definitely speaking of like the Reitzian interpretation of bureaucratic collectivism. So let me reread the sentence I'm drawing this from. If, despite everything, the voice of routine maintains that the bureaucracy looks after the interests of planning, then we must strip ourselves of all terminological camouflage and frankly recognize that the theory of bureaucratic collectivism is correct. Bureaucracy and planning are consubstantial for an entire historical period. They combine in a system where the former has the power to associate socialist production with a capitalist system of distribution, exploitation, and hierarchy. And that's another jab right there at Trotsky, right? Because that was one of Trotsky's ideas was that production in the USSR was socialist, while merely distribution was bourgeois. It's kind of like, even though the degenerated worker state label is, a convenient shorthand for describing Trotsky's overall theory, I think there's like another aspect to it, which is about like the production process, and I think that halfway between capitalism and socialism one is an important one. Socialist production with bourgeois distribution. Anyway, it's worth addressing a probable objection here. It would be little more than a game of sleight of hand to attempt to situate the Russian bureaucracy between the world proletariat and the world bourgeoisie, to represent it as torn and trembling between the revolutionary threat of the one and the reactionary threat of the other, and consequently obliged to continue to bear the cross of planning in order to defend itself against external attacks. When Russian statistics capable of showing the molecular process of social evolution can be freely examined, we shall see that it was precisely during the attack of the external bourgeoisie that the bureaucracy concentrated in its hands the greatest quantity of economic resources, identified with those of private capital, and definitely nibbled away at planning. The attack of the external bourgeoisie, let us imagine that of German imperialism, or a future attack of Anglo-American imperialism, finds no class within Russia situated to the right of the bureaucracy to save from, quote, Bolshevik barbarism, unquote. In the event of future military defeat of Russia, any transformation imposed by the victors will have to be carried out with the complicity of the bureaucracy and on its basis, even assuming an improbable thing that the descendants of the old capitalists and landowners expropriated by the revolution are compensated with new properties. The vast majority of wealth, which is of later creation, could find its most, quote, legitimate owners only within the bureaucracy, given the spoils and victors would seize. The situation in Russia would resemble that of defeated German imperialism. That's a very interesting paragraph. Because that's the justification, right, for, there's the two political positions of Trotsky and the Trotskyist movement. The two is political revolution in the USSR against the bureaucracy, and the other, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, whether or not the Stalinist totalitarian bureaucracy is in power or not. No matter what, the Trotskyist movement should defend the USSR in any conflict it may have with Western imperialism, even if that be Finland and Poland. He's saying right here that the notion that it seems like what he's saying here, at least, is that the sorry, maybe that's not what I'm saying here. Is that the bureaucracy would not there's no necessary reason to think that the bureaucracy would want the USSR once defeated, it would necessarily mean the privatization of capitalist property. I mean, of state property, even if it would mean mean exacting reparations of some kind. I don't know. Maybe that's not. That's probably not what's being said here. I'm not sure. Now I'm feeling unconfident in myself. Anyway, since any possibility of a right-wing social transformation that would completely destroy the bureaucracy is excluded, the bureaucracy regards the external threat in the same way as the capitalist class of any country. It goes to war to defend its prey and takes advantage of this to strengthen the chains imposed on the proletariat, the bureaucracy's main enemy, since it is the only one to threaten to destroy it radically, and shifts all the sacrifices onto it. It has no need to make concessions to the proletariat by developing planning, which does not mean that it denies itself the demagogic benefit of certain revolutionary traditions. It was at the moment when the German armies seemed closest to victory that Moscow placed the entire proletariat, already tied to the factory, like the feudal serf to the land, under martial law enforced by the GPU, and trumpeted the appearance of the, quote, Soviet millionaires. Those who are unable to deduce that these facts hide and persist in demanding figures, and more figures are just poor revolutionaries stuck on statistics. Looking at things closely, we see that the intervention of imperialist armies, even granting it victory in advance, threatens the bureaucracy less today as a social stratum than the intervention of feudal powers threatened the French bourgeoisie in 1814. It is not an exaggeration. Above all, with its present organization, Russia is, like the United States and England, a counter-revolutionary power of the first magnitude. The imperialists must feel terrified at the mere idea that the concentration and labor camps, the prisons and the political isolators could open up and vomit out from every country their millions of men eager for revenge against the bureaucracy, sustained by the hope of a return to October, among whom perhaps hundreds or thousands of Bolsheviks survive. A weakening of the bureaucracy would easily engender unsuspected possibilities for the restoration of revolutionary power. This is well known in London and Washington, and the Stalinist powers accorded the respect due to a guardian of an order that they themselves did not improve by occupying Russia. Second, the bureaucracy resembles the imperialist big bourgeoisie much more than the French bourgeoisie of 1814 resembles the feudal nobility of its attackers. The Stalinist leaders, often extremely wealthy, in fact lack title deeds to the means of production, but collective ownership of the means of production has become a legal fiction, increasingly removed from social reality. The intervention of the imperialists could at most accelerate the process of appropriation by the bureaucracy, the only possible path to a complete return to private property. There is therefore nothing, either internally or externally, that binds the bureaucracy to the proletariat and obliges the bureaucracy to continue to develop planning. The Fourth International must get rid of its static concept of the Russian bureaucracy. Its evolution has already come very far. We have no right to attribute to the Russian bureaucracy the particular characteristics of a workers' bureaucracy, but rather those of a class whose definitive structure is still in the process of crystallization, and which, in order to crystallize completely, must stifle the proletarian revolution wherever it appears and integrate itself into the decadent forms that world capitalism will adopt. We'll see later that the Stalinist organization of Russia could perhaps represent the vanguard of these forms. But before addressing this problem more broadly, let us penetrate the fortress of Stalinist planning, where the advocates of the defense of the USSR are entrenched. Let us define planning according to the Marxist criterion, and let us measure by this standard what is happening in Russia. We will discover that the fortress, lacking foundations, not only cannot be defended, but threatens to collapse on the heads of those who continue to entrench themselves within it. To better situate the question and avoid overlooking the forest, we must resort to a very simple Marxist notion, which, we believe, has been rather neglected in relation to the Soviet economy and bureaucracy. We are referring to the character of transitional society. The difference between this and capitalist society consists, economically, in the fact that ownership of the means of production is passed from the bourgeoisie to the producing classes who organize production in accordance with a plan satisfying social needs. If we were to take this essential idea of our conception of socialist development literally, we would have to conclude rigorously that Russian society ceases to be in transition to socialism and suffers a new expropriation at the moment when the producing classes are driven from political power and economic direction, which for many years has been a savagely established fact in Russia. But let us admit that between the purity of the ideological conception and living reality, there sometimes occurs a discrepancy with interstices that can be filled differently according to the concrete situation, without society losing its fundamental orientation towards socialism. In the case of Russia, the Stalinist bureaucracy would fill the interstices highlighted by the practical discrepancy of the transitional society in relation to the pure conception of this same society, and it would find there, at the same time, the basis of its differentiation from the proletariat as a bureaucracy, and the link of its particular function is a workers' bureaucracy, and the basis of its differentiation from the proletariat as a bureaucracy, and the link of its particular function as a workers' bureaucracy, with the historical function of the proletariat. In any case, however great the discrepancy may be, it cannot exceed certain limits without altering the very nature of society. It is already at first sight monstrous and repugnant to suppose any link between the Stalinist bureaucracy, which has largely exceeded all imaginable limits, and the historical function of the proletariat. In fact, both the International and Trotsky personally have repeatedly denied the existence of this link. But let us put a brake on sensitivity, although in questions of difficult elucidation it is frequently the best guide, and let us carry objectivity to the verge of idiocy. We know from the most glaring evidence that the proletariat in Russia has no more participation in political power than that which it feels through the constant terror of the GPU. We know that he is rigorously excluded from economic management and subjected to a system of exploitation much more iniquitous than in any capitalist country. We know that his share in the distribution of products is exactly that of the slave, while the bureaucracy surrounds itself with oriental pomp. We would nevertheless resign ourselves to believing that society continues to be in transition towards socialism if the bureaucracy, while criminal and thieving, directed the course of the economy in accordance with the historical necessities of general consumption. This is the reason and the aim of planning, which must not be confused with any plan of production. Without it, society can be in transition to anywhere except towards socialism. It is necessary to say here that the bureaucratic manipulation of statistics, practiced with special care in drawing up the projects and balance sheets of the 5-year plans, has so successfully achieved its goal of hiding the most important economic realities from the Soviet and world proletariat that it continues to hallucinate even many Trotskyists. But if we scrutinize the jumble of publicity figures, we will realize that neither we nor anyone outside the upper bureaucratic spheres has known in the last 10 years the basic figures of any economy moving towards socialism, even if at a snail's pace, namely the concrete distribution of the product of social labor, the basis of the reproduction and expansion of total wealth. And this was the only thing that would have allowed us to comprehensively discredit the progress of the economy and to assure without risk of error that the bureaucracy continued to develop planning in a progressive direction, or that its capitalist insertions, which no one in the International denies, were deviating and distorting planning. In bourgeois society, the expanded reproduction of capital is carried out starting with the interest of the owning class. In transitional society, as in communist society, expanded reproduction must be carried out starting from social necessities. Marx gave in his fundamental work the formula for capitalist reproduction: constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, where C represents constant capital or means of production, variable capital or means of subsistence for the workers, and PL, which I guess is what the initials for surplus value in French are surplus value. If I haven't said this already, I'm translating this with a Google Translate. And surplus value, the surplus value of the capitalist, which is divided into a part consumed by the capitalist in the form of means of subsistence, and another part capitalized for the increase of production or expanded reproduction. In capitalist society, constant capital can only increase to the extent that the capitalists find a market to realize the surplus value contained in the resulting surplus of commodities. And it is only in a certain proportion of the increase in constant capital that variable capital also increases. On the contrary, in a planned society, the increase in constant capital depends solely on the necessities of variable capital, which includes the entire population and the size of surplus value. But it ceases to be surplus value, properly speaking, that is the profit of the capitalists, but surplus labor at the disposal of society for the increase of constant capital and expanded reproduction in accordance with the population's needs. In other words, in a planned society, the necessary means of production are determined by the necessary means of subsistence. Consumption presides over capitalization, while to the extent that they satisfy the particular interests of the owning class. Karl Marx and Rosa Luxemburg observed that the scheme of expanded reproduction of capital retained its objective value for the planned economy, except that in this economy the ratio of the terms, constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, is definitively altered. Let us try to fix the difference to judge what is happening in Russia. Under capitalism, variable capital, wages are means of consumption for the working class. I don't like this conflation of wages and means of consumption for the working class being labeled under variable capital. And I suppose you could say that, but to my understanding, wages and the bundle of articles of consumption that is purchased with those wages are two different things. Variable capital spent by the capitalist is not purchased means of production. It purchases labor means of consumption for the worker. It purchases labor power from the worker. The worker uses his wages to purchase means of consumption, of course, but that's not what the worker does with his money is none of the capitalist who pays him's concern. The capitalist just pays him. So I think that variable capital, is a stricter meaning than how it's being used here. Under capitalism, variable capital, wages or means of consumption for the working class, is reduced to the minimum indispensable in relation to the conditions prevailing on the labor market. Far from intervening as a determining factor in the process of expanded reproduction, variable capital is only one of its results. On its part, surplus value, the surplus value concentrated in the hands of the owning class, is largely spent on the exorbitant consumption of its owners, and will, on the other hand, increase the total of constant capital, that is to say, the means of production, but only if it has the means to transform itself again into increased surplus value. The entire process of expanded reproduction, therefore, depends under capitalism on surplus value, more concretely on the appropriation of surplus labor. Just as a side note for myself, I would say that's not more concretely, that's more abstract. I would say that surplus value is a much more specific category than surplus labor. Anyway, the entire process of expanded reproduction therefore depends under capitalism on surplus value, more concretely on the appropriation of surplus labor, which is thus transformed into surplus value for the class that owns the means of production. From this comes the chaotic development and all the contradictions inherent in it, in capitalism. By means of a unification of control of private capital already being implemented in the major countries, chaotic development can be considerably attenuated, but this is only to bring out with greater violence the fundamental contradiction that opposes the character of capitalist production and distribution to the interests of consumption and the technical and cultural progress of humanity. To overcome this contradiction, it is not enough to eliminate private ownership of the means of production. It is also necessary to eliminate the appropriation of surplus value by a social category. Indeed, when the economy reaches a given point, already reached worldwide for some time, the process of expanded reproduction is hampered by the complete dependence of the relationship constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value on the interests of the social category that benefits from surplus value. This has important consequences, especially in the case of a social organization like the Russian one. The intervention of the proletarian revolution resolves the contradiction by placing the means of production in the hands of society, by making surplus value disappear as surplus value, wielded by a category of the population, and by treating surplus value as surplus labor, makes its capitalization dependent on the necessities of consumption. This is a weird use of categories. The fulcrum of the formula, constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, thus passes entirely from surplus value to variable capital. So from from value to variable capital, from surplus value to variable capital. So it changes who appropriates value. The fulcrum of the formula, constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, thus entirely passes from surplus value to variable capital. The latter becomes, from an incidental result of expanded reproduction, its determining factor. And furthermore, surplus value, restored to surplus value's legitimate nature as social surplus labor, can be transformed directly into new means of production without passing through the metamorphosis that capitalist surplus value is obliged to undergo in order to realize itself and invest itself anew, or it can be divided into a part intended for the subsequent increase in production and another intended for the increase in immediate consumption. The problem would depend largely, of course, on the form that the products will have when the products come into the world, on the relationship between the figures of the elements of production and the elements of consumption produced during each cycle. We are already in the desired domain of the planned economy, and this cannot be indifferent to the fate of the latter. In order to lighten this study as much as possible, we have eliminated until now the division established by Marx in the expanded reproduction of capital. Marx distinguishes a sector dedicated to the production of elements of production and another to the production of elements of consumption. This must be taken into account in the future because it is not arbitrarily that Marx makes expanded reproduction under capitalism start from the necessities of the elements of production section, whereas in a planned economy, it must arise from the necessities of the elements of consumption section. The difference is essential and implies the whole concept of consumption planning. On the basis of capitalism, the increase in constant capital is opposed to variable capital, or workers' consumption in a double sense. The increase in constant capital constitutes an end in itself for the exploiters of surplus value, and the disproportion between the increase of constant capital and variable capital is more disadvantageous for variable capital as the productivity of labor increases. On the basis of the planned economy, this double opposition disappears. Any calculation of expanding consumption otherwise, there cannot be a society in transition to socialism. Finally, let us try to determine the character of the terms of the formula constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value and their reciprocal relations in the expanded reproduction of a planned economy. Constant capital is passed from the capitalist to the community, dividing itself into instruments of production It's divided itself into instruments of production for the production of instruments of production and instruments of production for the production of consumer goods. Constant capital in these, after having passed into the community, passed from the capitalist to the community, can only be regarded as the mine from which the population extracts the wealth necessary for the organization of communist society. It is no longer governed by the capitalists of surplus value, but by the workers of variable capital. The term variable capital ceased to represent wage laborers or variable capital properly speaking. Variable capital now includes the consumption of the entire population. Since the category is not strictly included in this term, Bureaucrats, soldiers, policemen, teachers, writers, the sick, the incapable of work, etc., would receive their purchasing power from the total product of variable capital directly or through the intermediary of social organization. The fact that variable capital has ceased to represent wage labor means that, if under capitalism the necessities of the population disappear between constant capital and surplus value, that is, the means of production owned by a social category and the profits of the social category, in planning, variable capital appears dominating and combining constant capital and variable capital, taking itself as the measure of the other two terms. When variable capital loses this determining quality and transforms variable capital's self again into wage labor, planning becomes confused, goes backward, and any progressive economic development becomes impossible. For its part, surplus value also ceases to be the surplus value of a category of the population that reinvests that surplus value or spends that surplus value according to that category of the population's interests or inclinations. Surplus value is no longer anything but the surplus labor with which society relies to envisage expanded reproduction. It is entirely at the disposal of variable capital for the development of constant capital and for variable capital's own consumption. The impersonalization of surplus value is the most indispensable condition for the preservation and development of socialist planning. The concentration of surplus value in the hands of a social category, (it is useless for it to be the owner of the means of production in a strict sense), necessarily modifies distribution in the capitalist direction and cannot fail to imprint on expanded reproduction the direction necessary to aggravate the differences in distribution. The character of the means of production is thus affected. Without doubt, in the first stage of transitional society, when the distribution of products and customs retain the capitalist imprint, certain categories of the population still benefit from surplus value. This was the case during the early days of the Russian Revolution for technicians not affiliated with the Bolshevik Party whose work was paid for at a high price. However, the working population, being in possession of the tools of work, had the distribution of surplus value. In exchange, it becomes impossible to attribute the same exceptional and harmless character to the systematic exploitation of surplus value practiced by the Stalinist bureaucracy. If we take a production cycle immediately following capitalist society, planned reproduction will have to begin by deducting from the total product a quantity of consumer items for the population approximately equal to that used for the same purpose under capitalism, another quantity of means of production to replace those which have been worn out, a quantity which is incorporated in the products obtained. The remainder of the production, which constitutes surplus labor, which from the first moment will be much higher than that obtained under capitalism, thanks to the disappearance of waste by capitalist classes and the reduction of administrative and government expenses, will remain in the hands of society to expand production in the following cycle. The image of transitional society is that left by Karl Marx in the Critique of the Gotha Program. It is not superfluous to recall that Marx, after having deduced what is necessary to increase production, supposes that there is still some left to increase the immediate consumption of workers. Thus he indicated on the one hand that, in transitional society, products lose the category of commodity, which they have under capitalism, and that on the other hand, in relation to historical goals, distribution is the goal, collective property and planning the means, we can in this make a concession to the mechanistic objectivity in which the voice of routine is entrenched, and recognize that the complete use of social surplus labor in the increase of constant capital does not alter the character of transitional society during its first cycles. This only poses with greater magnitude the problem of distribution in the following cycles, which will give an increasing mass of products. Even if we go so far as to suppose that at the beginning of all the social surplus labor appears in the section of the elements of production, except for a minimum of elements of consumption indispensable for the consumption of the additional workers who will put the new machines into operation, it is impossible to look at a series of production cycles of 10 or 20 years, for example, without the uninterrupted increase of constant capital, coming from an increase in the consumption of variable capital. The fate of the transitional society, that is to say of the planned economy, is decided there. It is not only a question of the immediate satisfaction of a working class that a lame objectivity too casually underestimates, but of the material conditions which must permit a constant rise in the technical and cultural level, without which planning becomes impracticable, transforms itself into a simple plan, and the plan into an expression of the interests of a social category. In short, for the expanded reproduction of the transitional society to retain its socialist tendency, it is necessary, 1, that surplus labor, or surplus value, ceases to be concentrated in one social category, otherwise its distribution between constant capital and variable capital cannot be done in accordance with the interest of variable capital, but in accordance with the interests of the social category that handles surplus value. This is the cornerstone of planning. 2. That products lose the commodity character they have under capitalism. Otherwise, mass consumption and capitalization would be hindered by the realization of surplus value in the form of money or possessions, as in bourgeois society, favoring the development of social strata that are especially interested in it. Okay, so this is important, right? He keeps using surplus value and surplus labor kind of like almost interchangeably, at least when he's talking about a planned socialist or a planned transitional economy. And so, if he's going to he's talking about this surplus value that's essentially now at the hands of the workers, no longer needing to be sold. This is not surplus value. This is just surplus quantities of stuff. So this is kind of confusing because this part here seems to be contradicting things he said elsewhere. Value is necessarily represented in money, and value is necessarily proved to exist via the sale of a commodity. So surplus value is fundamentally dependent upon sales. Anyway, or the entire capital circuit breaks down. You can't buy means of production and pay wage labor for the next round of production if the surplus in the commodities produced is not validated by sale of those commodities on the market. If the buying and selling breaks down, you have no capital, and hence no surplus labor, and that cancels out the possibility. Means surplus value. So surplus value is a fundamentally sales-dependent category. And that's a very important thing, right? He keeps showing this value composition thing without referencing like constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value, without showing the general formula capital, which has sales, two different sales and purchasing, selling and purchasing processes in it, right? Purchase a means of production. Well, from the perspective of the capitalist, two moments, right? Purchasing a means of production and labor power, and also the selling of the commodity for an increased sum of money. Anyway, 3. The technical education and general culture of the working population included in variable capital rises. The condition is a consequence of distribution. Without it, the very increase of constant capital and planning are limited by the capacity, which also represents economic interests, of the technically capable minority. Moreover, it is also a condition for the weakening and disappearance of the state. Without these conditions, collective ownership of the means of production becomes fictitious and man continues to be separated from the instruments of work. The origin of any society divided into classes. Even the most ardent defenders of Russia would not dare to assert that the distribution of the product of labor was carried out by the working population included in variable capital, or even with respect to its elementary interests. Ever since planning began to become a world-known fact, the Stalinist Thermidor having already triumphed, social surplus labor has been handled by the bureaucracy. And again, this term, I don't know if I said this already, but, at least in Trotsky, from what I understand, there's a changing use of the word Thermidor. Trotsky at first denied that Thermidor had happened because there had been no counter-revolution, privatizing nationalized property, so therefore Thermidor didn't happen because Thermidor was associated with a counter-revolution. Then Trotsky changed his conception of Thermidor. Trotsky said that it was like a moment of reaction within the political apparatus that preserved without changing property relations, right? So in the case of Thermidor, Thermidor put the brakes on the revolutionary and democratic elements of the French Revolution, while at the same time preserving the French Revolution's social gains, right? It did not restore the monarchy. It did not restore feudal arrangements. It did not restore the nobility, but it just merely, it was a kind of like a proto-Bonapartism before Bonaparte, in the sense of kind of changing the political sphere while preserving the overall property framework. And that's what Trotsky eventually says happens in the case of Stalinism, right? Stalinism was a Thermidor, but it wasn't a counter-revolution, right? For Trotsky, a counter-revolution would have been the privatization of the nationalized property. The Stalinists, and this is related to his conception of Bonaparte, Stalinism was fundamentally Bonapartist in the sense that it preserved the semi-socialist character of the capitalist of the Soviet economy, while at the same time politically expropriating the working class, and hence politically expropriating the working class, right? So, in the case of Trotsky, Thermidor is not synonymous with counter-revolution. That's a very important point. Thermidor is not counter-revolution. So let me repeat this last sentence that he said so I'm not getting too lost. Ever since planning began to become a world-known fact, the Stalinist Thermidor having triumphed, social surplus labor has been handled by the bureaucracy. Behind surplus value, there was, from that moment, as under capitalism, a group of men surplus value thus recovered its character of surplus value to the extent that the bureaucracy asserted its domination. And see, this is a tricky thing, because he's like as he said before, that he's saying that reducing surplus value to surplus labor, right? Which is a mistake, right? From any kind of close reading of Marx's Capital, right? Like labor isn't value, right? And surplus labor isn't surplus value. So saying that, talking about like the surplus labor of a society and using that kind of interchangeably with the term surplus value is like a failure of fair to use categories properly. So it's like he's using the symbol for surplus value and using it interchangeably for surplus value and surplus labor. So when he uses these terms in a sentence, it gets contradictory. Behind surplus value, there was from that moment, after the Soviet Thermidor, or the Stalinist Thermidor, as under capitalism, a group of men. Surplus labor thus recovered, surplus value thus recovered surplus value's character of surplus value to the extent that the bureaucracy asserted the bureaucracy's domination. It is not new to say that, in Russian planning, the interests of the bureaucracy have always been present, but we have the most imperative duty to recognize all the consequences arising from the fact that constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value was not governed by variable capital, something indispensable in a system of production for consumption, but by a social category lying in wait behind surplus value. What can be observed first of all is that even in its best period, that of the first 5-year plan, planning produced only to satisfy military needs and the new consumer needs of the bureaucracy, no less exorbitant than those of the bourgeoisie. Without doubt, military needs in a revolutionary country surrounded by capitalism are part of the general needs of the country, but, interpreted by the bureaucracy, they bore the stamp of its reactionary political and social character. By renouncing the great strategic objective of the proletariat, the world revolution, Stalinism was not carrying out a defensive maneuver or a simple opportunistic error. Stalinism was translating its internal counter-revolutionary needs on an international scale. The nature and mission of the army, therefore, had to undergo a radical alteration. Stalin needed a large barracks army, a Prussian army in the most Prussian sense of the word, directed as much against external powers as against the international revolution, principally in the bordering countries, and above all against the Soviet masses. Indeed, the Stalinist army is above all a counter-revolutionary police force, through whose necessities the economic bases of the bureaucracy flourish. The army offers him the widest field of differentiation at the same time as the military apparatus indispensable for keeping the population crushed. When in the middle of the second decade of this century, Stalin, already firmly established in power at the left opposition, quote, "The present cages can only be changed by a civil war," end quote. This is not a polemical phrase. Stalin was referring to the army and the police and signaling a monstrous development of both. So much so that today Russia is the most militaristic country in the world. Franco's Spain itself is inferior in this respect. Franco allocated a little over 35% of the total state budget for 1946 to military spending. Stalin, in 1945, dedicated more than 45% to the same. It should be noted, though, just as a side note. I mean, I'm not sure what what this means, what this precisely means, but Franco's Spain sat out the Second World War. So, whereas the Soviet Union did not. And it had fronts in 1945, for most of 1945 at least, in both Eastern Europe as it expanded, after to push the Nazis back to Germany, but also in 1945, the USSR entered the Pacific Theater as well. Um, and so it would make sense that the Soviet economy would have dedicated so much of its spending to military ends. Not that this doesn't mean that it wasn't an exceptionally militaristic society, but the comparison with Franco seems not a great argument. Franco's Spain itself is inferior in this respect. Franco allocated a little over 35% of the total state budget from 1946 to military spending. Stalin in 1945 dedicated more than 45% to the same ends. And we know that Stalin promised to increase, not decrease, war spending in the first peace budget. Again, it should be noted that probably, not to go to bat for the Stalinist Soviet Union, but also 1945 was the year that the United States used the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which was definitely, I think it's generally considered in the historiography that there's a degree to which the use of the atomic bomb was something of a signal to the USSR. They don't think that's just like a crank position. Anyway, and we know that Stalin promised to increase, not decrease, war spending in the first peace budget. Let us add that in Franco's percentage we have included police spending, which is shown separately. It is impossible to do the same with Stalin's budget because Stalin hides police spending under other headings, perhaps under the heading social and cultural sector. Since 1929, the standard of living of the Russian working masses have been falling continuously. It reached its highest point in 1928, at 25% above its level of 1913, on the eve of the First World War. As the 5-year plans were implemented, inflation, the continual rise in prices, and the massive taxes being discharged ever more heavily on articles of popular consumption, gradually restricted real wages to such an extent that if in 1928 they were at the index of 125 compared to 1913, on the eve of Russia's entry into the Second World War in 1940, they had fallen to 62. This is something, the taxation on articles of consumption is something that Raya Dunayevskaya makes a lot out of in her work from this same period. This fall in the standard of living of the masses is indirectly confirmed by the bureaucracy, which has not published price indices since 1930. 3 5-year plans have reduced mass consumption to half of what it was before the consolidation of Stalinist Thermidor. We can get a rough idea of the intensive exploitation to which the Russian proletariat is subjected from the following fact, optimistically exhibited in the official statistics. In 1939, the working day of a Caucasian produced 98 kilos of grain, and the pay for the same day was equivalent to 4 kilos, which gave an unpaid work balance or surplus value higher than 96%. Factory workers are certainly not in a better position. This explains why the president of the American Chamber of Commerce, Johnston, turned pale with envy when observing the methods of exploitation practiced in Russian factories. What determines this horrible exploitation? The necessity of an economy in transition to socialism, or simply progressive? Nonsense. Only the reactionary economic interests of the ruling caste. To the extent that the share in the distribution of the total product of labor was reduced, the remaining surplus labor necessarily increased. What was done with it? How was it used? an enormous part which no one is in a position to calculate, because it is the part that the Kremlin has the greatest interest in hiding, is squandered by what the rulers themselves call the intelligentsia, that is to say, the privileged caste, from the foremen or Stakhanovites to the, quote, father of the peoples, end quote, by way of engineers and factory directors, kolkhoz peasants, army officers, GPU agents, and mercenary writers. Another part, even less calculable, was hoarded by the same rabble for which the much celebrated, quote, Soviet millionaires emerged. The rest has been capitalized with the most complete disregard for the needs of social consumption, or more precisely of mass consumption, since the production of luxury goods is the only one that has recorded a large percentage of increase among all elements of consumption. Expanded reproduction was polarized in the production elements section, and within this, not in the sector that would allow the development of the production elements of the consumer goods section, but also almost exclusively in the war production sector. In 1929, consumer goods represented 55.6% of total production. In 1939, only 39%, a reduction of more than 16%, which is actually much more if we take into account the increase in population. As a result, war expenditures fell from 8.9% of the 1933 budget to 45% in 1945, and development in this direction continues. However, despite the bottomless pit of military investments, total investments in industry fell from 60.8% of the budget in 1933 to 33% in 1940. Expanded reproduction obviously clashed with the economic interests of the intelligentsia, and what revolutionary objectivity does in an economy whose development is limited and determined by the interests of a social minority contain? None. This same characteristic constitutes the origin of the reactionary nature of the capitalist economy, a nature from which the Russian economy of today is no exception. By asserting the contrary, the advocates of the defense of the USSR once again fall into the realm of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, unless they identify the mission of Stalinism with that of the bourgeoisie in its progressive era. We can still emphasize the reactionary character of the Russian economy with impressive facts. For example, taxes. Stalinism used a system of taxation on essential goods that disappeared in Western Europe with the Middle Ages. Bread pays a tax of 75%, other agricultural products 89%, and while soap products pay from 21 to 37%, percale is taxed 48%, and oil, necessary for popular lighting and heating in many places, 88%. From this comes that 20% of state revenues in 1940 were not made up of indirect taxes. From this comes that 20% of state revenues in 1940 were made up of indirect taxes, and in 1945, 40%. In exchange, the products of heavy industry are taxed only 0.5 to 1%, which does not represent a facility for industrialization, but for the concentration of surplus value in the hands of the intelligentsia. The directors of factories and trusts participate in the profits of their companies. 4% up to the limit provided for, and 50% for the surpluses. We will now dwell further on these facts, considered as trifles by those who console themselves by imagining how progressive planning and nationalization in the, quote, degenerated workers' state, and, quote, are, quote, despite everything. Let's attack them in their latest entrenchments. For this, we must return for a moment to the formula of expanded reproduction, which, although arid, is relentless in laying bare the nature of an economy. As we have seen from the beginning of the first 5-year plan to the end of the third, real wages suffered a reduction of 50%. The overall balance of surplus value must have increased to the same extent or more if Stakhanovism, universal piecework, and mechanization increased average productivity. In the ratios of the formula, constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value were governed by the subsequent, if not immediate, interest of variable capital, a basic assumption indispensable to planning in the Marxist sense. Each cycle of economic rotation between 1929 and 1940 should have recorded a geometric increase in the capitalization of production. The reality that emerges from the figures given in the preceding pages is relatively insignificant and frequently turns into a decline. Where did the 50% of surplus value wrested from the proletariat between 1929 and 1940 go? Necessarily into the pockets of the intelligentsia, because surplus value does not evaporate, and moreover, in a society that has just expropriated the expropriators, the multiple and monstrous material privileges held today in Russia by several million individuals cannot be constituted without reinforcing the exploitation of the masses to a greater degree than under the old possessing classes. 20 years ago, the bureaucracy started from nothing, while the bourgeoisie relied on centuries of progressive accumulation and consecration of its, quote, rights. Hence it is that for the Stalinist counter-revolution, it is a matter of life or death, a historical imperative in the reactionary sense, to continually burden variable capital with more work and less pay. Splendid transition to socialism! ! This video's gotten fairly long, so I'm going to cut it off here. This is going to be the end of part 1. Yeah, thanks for listening.